onto the side because the camera's facing this way. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good to see you all here in person and virtually. My name is Odorek Amande. I'm the Community Knowledge Manager at the Community Foundation, and thank you for joining us this morning for our board training and nonprofit training. For people on Zoom, please keep yourselves muted throughout the entirety of the presentation. If you have any questions, you feel free to put them in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat, and I'll let our presenters know if you have any questions. I can signal them to answer your questions. And this training will be recorded, so if you need to look at it in the future, it'll be available on our foundation's YouTube channel. So to get started, I want to announce our presenters. Betsy Pennewell. JD serves as General Counsel to the Community Foundation of Sarasota County. She's responsible for managing the legal duties and responsibilities of the organization to protect the organization's interests and to ensure that all state and federal laws are followed. She facilitates complex gift transactions and business transactions on behalf of the organization, reviews and negotiates foundation contracts, and provides support to the foundation donors and related organizations. She stays current in all charitable giving legal matters and is responsible for fostering excellent relationships with professional advisors and stewards of portfolio of donors. And Christy Nolan is founder and president of Mission Matters Consulting and Coaching Group, a firm specializing in improving the performance and impact of nonprofit organizations and those who lead them. For over 15 years, Christy has worked in the nonprofit sector as a staff member, a community foundation vice president, interim executive director, trainer, consultant, and board member. Christy received her Master of Science in Industrial Organizational Psychology from Valdosta State University, and she holds an undergraduate degree in psychology from Purdue University. So without further ado, our presenters.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. Christy and I are very excited to do this program today. This is our first time doing the program, so we don't have any expectations on how it should go. We hope this is interactive. We're thrilled to have a live audience because I prefer to present before live people so we can keep it interactive. We can answer your questions as we go along. Those of you on Zoom, send your questions via chat to Odie. If we stop for questions and she wants to unmute you, she will, but we do want to keep this interactive. Before I go through the agenda, who in the audience, the present audience, who's a board member? Okay, good. We've got some board members. Executive director or president and CEO? Okay, and then what about development? Okay, great. That's kind of who we thought was attending today. When you saw the title, so legal and ethical considerations for nonprofit organizations, what are you hoping to get out of today? We have our agenda, which I'll cover, but you saw the title, you're like, huh, this is interesting. What do you hope to get out of today? Yeah.
Stuff that you've already sent us, but the whole list of what are the policies that the organization should have at the board level.
Okay, we're going to definitely talk about policies today.
Actually, mechanically, how the policies are developed and to be in compliance.
Okay. Anything else? Martha?
We're a new organization, so for us, it'll be getting a good, strong sense of the skeleton so that then we're more aware of how we're putting flesh on the skeleton as we grow and plan for the short term and long term.
Okay, great. Yes.
Best practices for a nonprofit corporation.
Okay, we're definitely going to cover that. So our agenda today, and Christy and I are going to divide things up. Christy will do some talking in a few short minutes, but we're going to cover legal responsibilities and documents. We're going to talk a lot about policies, where you can find policies, which is pretty simple. We're going to talk about risk management and insurance. It's really important that you have a good relationship with an insurance agent. We're going to discuss financial matters, what you're required to file and what you should be operating under within your organization. We're going to talk about lobbying and political activities and sunshine laws. Is anybody in the room subject to sunshine laws? Okay, maybe if you're via Zoom, if you're subject to online or sunshine laws, please let Odie know. And then contracts and I assume we're gonna have time. We have 2 hours, a little less than 2 hours. I want to talk about gift agreements and some good things, what should be in gift agreements, and then memorandum of understandings, which is a different type of agreement between parties. I draft those regularly, so we're going to cover those things. I am an attorney. I'm a practicing licensed attorney. This is not legal advice. This is solely for educational purposes only. We're giving you some guidance. We may not be able to answer really detailed questions. We are happy to recommend lawyers in town who work with nonprofit organizations in their day-to-day business and CPAs. So please know this is educational purposes only.
So Betsy, I'm
Yeah.
gonna just pause. Was there any questions, anything from the Zoom group that we wanna, okay, super.
Thank you, Christine. So monitoring and monitoring, regulating, and governing a board. It's really important when you bring on new board members that you onboard them and let them know that they have a certain level of legal responsibility for your organization. They're subject to basically 3 types of liabilities: corporate liability, federal liability, and general liability, which we're going to cover in a minute. But it's really important that your board members, and we're in Sarasota, or really Manatee, Sarasota, Charlotte. We have fantastic retirees that come down here that have run businesses. They're been CPAs at, the top CPA firms in the country. They're CEOs, they're CFOs, and they've kind of lost their identity from when they were working. They've now retired. They're feeling like, okay, I need something to occupy my time. So I'm going to get involved with board involvement. And I want to come in and I want to look at your financials and I want to tell you how you should be doing things. And that is not a board member's role. It's great to have them on your board for you to ask questions to, for you to gain understanding. But board members approve and disapprove issues brought to them on behalf of the staff. Staff does operations. And if your board members get involved with operations, you're going to, and hopefully you have D&O insurance, and we're going to talk about directors and officers insurance. But if your board members cross the line and get involved with operations, it can invalidate that insurance. And if you have a liability claim, it can pierce that insurance. And those board members can be personally liable. So it's really important. And I've seen it. I've had to have conversations with our board members who've wanted to get a little too involved. They didn't realize they were getting involved. But some of the actions we had to say, whoa, you got to stay in your lane. So that's really important. So that's what I want to cover about that. In terms of the 3 liabilities, so corporate liabilities, you've got to comply. And I don't know what this is, Odie. Should I go over to the?
While we're working that out, who else regulates nonprofits other than the government? Speak a little louder. Who else regulates nonprofits' behavior? Okay, that's government. Who else?
The director, maybe?
Okay, yes, outside of the organization, who regulates their behavior? Think broadly. Donors,
Your constituents or stakeholders.
yes,
whoever you-
stakeholders, right? Right? Because as nonprofits, we know our reputation is so important. So watchdog groups, the media, all of those entities, why not legally regulating? They are regulating the behavior. I often will tell nonprofits, if you're making a decision on something or something has happened, use the front page of the newspaper rule. So if this is on the front page of the newspaper, can we as a board defend our actions? Right? What would be the implications to our organization, to our reputation, to our donations, if this is on the front page of the paper? So you see, there's other entities that can regulate the behavior and actions of nonprofits other than the government.
And you do, I mean, if you get the Herald Tribune, I look at the golf section every morning to see who's being named in it. Is there anything being discussed about our organization? It's important to pay attention to the media. And with what, the political environment in Florida and all the things happening with education and everything, we see a lot being discussed in the media. So very good points, Christy. Thank you. With these three types of liabilities, so corporate liabilities, you've got to comply with state laws. You've got to, when you form your nonprofit corporation, you've got to register with the Department of State. We get a certification of our articles of incorporation. You've got to file an annual report every year that's in compliance with state law. If you fail to do that, if you don't do it, I think May 1st is the deadline, they'll dissolve you. And then you've got to get your incorporation back active again. So, and the state laws, we're seeing a lot of state laws that are regulating some of our nonprofit entities here. And you want to make sure you know what the state laws are and whether or not you're operating in compliance with the laws. So, and you also want, you've got employees, you got to be in compliance with employment laws and those type of things. So corporate liabilities is what corporations have to follow. We're going to talk about articles and bylaws a little bit later. Federal liability, you've been determined to be a tax exempt organization. Make sure your mission and what you do on a day-to-day purpose is for tax exempt purposes, and don't cross that line or you could lose your tax exempt. Status. And these are when policies come into play, which we will get into policies, but you've got to have a conflict of interest policy. You have to have a non-discrimination policy, an anti-harassment policy, whistleblower, data protection, document retention. All of these things are really important that you have, and your board needs to approve those. And you should be reviewing, when we talk about policies, you should have somebody on staff reviewing your policies on a regular basis to make sure you're operating in accordance with them, and if operations have changed, maybe they need to be amended. Also, what you discuss in your board meetings, that's your proprietary information. What's discussed at board meetings, what's discussed at staff meetings, committee meetings, and your board members they're involved in a lot of different things. So when we talk about conflicts of interest, it's really important. You need to know, do they have a conflict? Do they need to abstain from something they might be voting upon? You may even want them to leave the room so there can be open discussion for the rest of the board members. And those things happen fast, and we see it here at the Community Foundation, that a board member, wants to give their opinion, and then we're like, well, you have a conflict, and it's hard to push them out of the room when they really want to, support whatever they're talking about. But you need to pay attention to those, and those need to be documented in your minutes. General liability, when we talk about insurance, most liability claims are employment claims, and they are discrimination, harassment, retaliation, wage and hour claims. That's going to be what you're going to be held for liability. We own this building here, so if you slip and fall when you come or go, we've got to make sure we have insurance. So if you sue us, which you're most likely because you're going to have medical bills and you're going to want us to pay those, we need to make sure we have insurance. So we're going to cover insurance in a little bit, but having a good relationship with an insurance agent to talk about what you do and what your business is and how many employees you have is important. And your board should approve for you to purchase insurance, and it should be written in your bylaws. That's about all I want to cover. Anything you want to cover on liabilities?
So what do you think is the number one reason nonprofits are sued?
Donor intent's not followed? No.
Yes.
Human resources reasons.
Employment law related matters. We're not covering
Yeah.
HR and employment law today. We know some great attorneys in town if you have employment law related things, but it is a risky area. And so we're encouraging you to be very diligent and intentional about your employment law matters and policies. Yes, ma'am.
Our organization is all volunteer, including the board, so we have no employees. However, slip and fall is something else entirely. Is there some sort of interim insurance for volunteer might feel discriminated against or something of that nature? Have there been any issues with volunteer as opposed to employee related issues?
You know, I couldn't really speak to that. I mean, you don't necessarily have a contract with a volunteer as you have a contract with an employee. So it probably would fall under different. But it's important to have insurance for any type of risk associated
And
because a
again-
volunteer can sue your agency just as easy as an employee can.
Yeah, and that's, again, we're keeping things really high level because we really don't have the expertise on that, but you want to have a good relationship with an insurance agent. And I would, if I was a new organization, sit down and say, okay, here's how we're run. What insurance do you recommend? And, I think they'll give you a solid answer. Another thing I forgot to mention, so we're all nonprofit organizations and you solicit money, contributions. You've got to make sure you're in compliance with the Florida Solicitation Act and you need to register. And if you have, if you're soliciting donations on your website or you're putting it in written print or your tickets and you're asking for a donation, there's certain language that you must disclose and it's in the statute. And if you're registered, they'll tell you, okay, it's got to be conspicuous. And then you got to have your registration number. And if you don't have that, if you let it expire, you can lose your tax exempt if you're soliciting and you don't have this registration number. So that's another important, and we're going to talk about, I think when we talk about financial matters, I'll bring this up again, but please make sure
Yeah.
you're
And
registered.
my understanding of that is you have to register in every state that you're going to be
Yes.
soliciting in.
Yep.
Yes. So if you're sending donation letters to your donors that, are in the north in the summer, you have to make sure you are registered in those states to solicit. Yes.
And then also the international data compliance is another one. If you, especially like when we do the giving challenge and we have donors from other countries.
Okay. Yep. Thank you for saying that. Yes, ma'am.
Betsy, you were very clear about separating the activities of the board and staff members. What if you don't have any staff members? And everything is run from the board.
Well, that is a very good question. I don't know if I have an answer for that. And that's probably you might want to talk to a lawyer who deals with nonprofits all the time, who deals with volunteer boards. That's a really good question. I don't have an answer for you.
Right. As long as no one's being paid to do that, then you don't have, the contract, the employment contract. What I see with AVOs or all volunteer organizations is they delegate certain roles to certain board members. So usually the president of the board may do a lot of the administrative functions that you would see an executive director do. I see a lot of challenges with AVOs, and they struggle around role clarity and role accountability. And so, those are important discussions that you need to have at the board level. Yes.
I may have missed it, but when you were talking about solicitation licenses in other states, you were talking about online solicitations, correct?
If you have written that you are soliciting, then you want to be in compliance. Now, if your targeted donor base, most people who live in Florida are Florida residents, even if they have two homes, because the advantages of being a Florida resident, your homestead's protected, you don't pay income tax or state income tax. Most donors here are just here in Florida, but if you're actively soliciting people out of state, you should be registered in those states.
Direct mail or phone call.
Even if you send
Direct
mail or
Okay,
Direct mail.
I thought it was just for online.
Any kind of
And I-
solicitation.
I believe that Giving USA publishes for 1999. You can get a list of all of the states where you register at. You have that. Okay.
Yeah, I just thought it was for online. So that's helpful.
And you can hire companies to register for you. There, you can. All right, Christy, I'm turning it over to
All
you.
right, so how many of you, by a show of hands, have ever said that I want to serve on, or if your staff work for a mediocre board? Right, nobody ever says that, because we all want to be part of something exceptional. Well, exceptional boards don't just happen. They take planning, they take intention, that it's ongoing and never ending. Board development is not something that you arrive at. It is an ongoing, never ending activity. And what I've learned over the last 20 plus years of working with nonprofits is the better a board understands governance, the better governed the organization will be. So what we have here is really the 4 responsibility areas of nonprofit boards. The first is setting the direction of the organization. This is one of the most important roles of the board of directors. Determining the mission, the vision, the values. Those 3 pieces are fundamental to your strategic direction. And you want to make sure your programs, your activities, everything aligns with those 3 fundamental pieces. So if you haven't revisited your mission, your vision, your value statement in a while, it's a good idea to do that. Typically, it's done as part of a larger strategic planning process, which brings me to the next one under setting the direction is ensuring effective planning. So I mentioned strategic planning. What are other board approved plans that should be in place? What are other board approved plans?
Fundraising.
Fundraising plan, which supports your strategic plan, your strategic direction. This is saying how we are going to raise the money to fund this. What else? What other plans would the board be reviewing and approving?
Communication.
Communications plan, okay, which is very much tied to fund development. Other plans? Yes, ma'am.
Going along with communications, marketing.
Yep, marketing and communications plans. Yes, Odie,
Someone in the chat said succession.
succession plans, certainly, because that will help set the direction of the organization, the next leadership. Because leadership transitions can be very destabilizing for a nonprofit organization. Yes, ma'am.
The continuity of operations.
Continuity of operations. There's one big one that you all haven't said yet. What's that?
Emergency management.
Okay,
So
sure,
here
yes,
it's like a
ma'am.
hurricane plan or whatever.
Emergency management.
And in the chat, there is whistleblower and dock destruction.
Okay, that gets more into sort of the oversight. I'm thinking budgets. That's a plan.
Yeah.
Right? How are we going to achieve our mission financially in the next year? So the board needs to be involved in budget preparation and planning and approval of your budget. I am still surprised, and this happens a lot with AVOs, how often budgets are not reviewed by the board or approved by the board. So that's fundamental. So setting the organization. Next is ensuring necessary resources. So making sure that the organization, if the board is approving the budget, making sure that the organization has those financial resources to actually fulfill the budget. So being involved in fundraising is definitely a part of the board's responsibility. I always say that board members are bridge builders. They are building community between the organization and the community. They are that network. They don't have to be rock star fundraisers, but you can be a rock star fundraiser and never ask anybody for money. Just bringing people to the table as a board member and just understanding that that is part of your responsibilities as a board member, is to participate actively in the fund development process. Select the chief executive. So how many employees does the board manage? 1. just one
In our
employee,
case.
right? So Betsy had mentioned about sort of micromanaging, board sort of stepping over. We see this a lot where board members tend to walk among the trees and forget they're supposed to be forest people. So it's a good opportunity to remind them that there is a line there and it's very important. And there's a reason why there's a distinction between the role of the board and the role of the staff. But making sure that you're selecting a competent and capable executive director is the best executive director that you can afford as an organization, because that executive director can make all the difference in the success of your organization. They are the face of the organization. They are, whether you have development staff, they are the chief development officer. Some donors want to work directly with them. The relationship with the board and the chief executive, one of the biggest red flags when I'm doing governance work is I want to know, what is the relationship like between the chair and the CEO? Because if that relationship is shaky and not solid, then I have real concerns about their capacity to really make governance changes that need to be made. So that relationship is so important. Yes.
Your executive director, your president, CEO, they are the face of the organization. And that many times, this community, we have so many different events and you're out and about. And yes, if you have development people, your development people are out, but the donors really pay attention to who your leader of the organization is. And so that when you're deciding who's going to be that person, they really have to have the presence, the personality to embrace the community and the community embrace them, especially for nonprofit organizations.
Right. And fundraising success is really about relationship building. You're building relationships, you're building community around your cause. Next one is building a competent board. So making sure that when you're bringing people onto the board, that they understand what's expected of them. You do an orientation for new board members to the organization, as well as an orientation to the board of directors. And we can talk a little bit more about that in a subsequent slide. But I have seen where foundations in this community are reluctant to give grants to organizations because of particular board members and those board members' reputations in the community. So it's very, very important that you're bringing on people to your board that are highly respected. When I'm interviewing stakeholders in the community, when I do strategic planning, they're always asking who's on their board. I don't recognize anybody on their board. Are these people that are out in the community visible? Are they well respected? And so people are looking at who is on your board and what value they bring, because they bring that third party credibility to your organization. So, no longer are the days is if they can fog a mirror, they can be on our board. That's criteria needs to be elevated. Not just any warm body. We really want to be thoughtful and intentional about who we're bringing on our board, and helping them be competent board members as well through board orientation and ongoing education. So why do you think I have enhanced the organization of public standing under this heading of ensuring necessary resources?
Well, if your organization is not in good public standing, then your donors are not going to want to contribute money to your organization, right?
Absolutely. And transparency is the currency of trust. So, and as a nonprofit, if you don't have trust, it's very hard for you to even exist in this community. And I've seen organizations dissolve because in a very public way, they lost the public trust. And oftentimes it starts with the board. The board's either asleep at the wheel. There's one organization, and they'll remain anonymous because they no longer exist. But for 2 years, their treasurer did not attend a board meeting. For 2 years, their treasurer did not attend a board meeting. And they were still the treasurer of this organization. It played out very publicly in the newspaper. There was a lot of malfeasance that was happening. And, as board members, we have to say, not on my watch. we're going to be much more vigilant and watchful and provide that oversight because there are areas of vulnerabilities and it is our job to protect the organization from and to honor the public trust and make sure that that's a high priority. Next is providing oversight. So board members, thinking of yourself as a sentinel. You are on the lookout for vulnerabilities and your aim is to protect the organization's assets as well as the organization's reputation. So this is really about financial stewardship, legal compliance, risk management. Also, we include under there monitoring and strengthening the programs and services. So making sure that your programs and services outcomes are actually achieving what you say they achieve. I find a lot of times boards sort of abdicate that oversight function to the staff because they don't necessarily know or understand the programs, but it does oversight of programs, making sure that our program outcomes are actually achieving what we as an organization say that they are, that we're actually making a difference, that we tell our donors that we are. That is something that oversight does fall back onto the board. Now, we don't want board members to get into micromanaging and the details of how programs are delivered, et cetera, but the oversight function of are we achieving our outcomes? What we say we're going to do certainly falls on the board. And then executive oversight. So we talked about the board oversees one employee, and that's the CEO, but making sure that you do an annual performance evaluation for the CEO. How many CEOs in this room have received their annual performance review in the last year? Okay, so about half the room in here were CEOs and no hand went up. That's concerning, right? Because that is an opportunity to strengthen the organization. It's a way to communicate between the board and the staff. And the intent there is really to improve the management and operations of the organization through the work and leadership of the CEO. Most CEOs tell us nationally, there's Board Source publishes a report called Leading with Impact. Most CEOs give the board a B- C around performance review. And about only 45% have received a performance review in the last year. And that's concerning. That is the board's responsibility to do that. And it's a good opportunity to have a dialogue about how the organization is performing, how it's being led, et cetera.
I just want to add a comment to that. It's great if you can get a retired or a working HR person on your board. That HR person is going to remember that performance evaluations are important. So that as we talk about things, if I can remember to say them, and if you think about them, as you hear things, okay, what types of board members do you want? Yes, you want them in the community and you want that people to be able to see them, but you also want to think about what type of skills they will bring to help your organization.
And the last area under good board governance, it is the board's responsibility to lead board operations. It's not the staff's responsibility. It is the board's responsibility. They're a self-perpetuating board, so they need to be responsible for recruiting new board members. Every board member needs to be on the lookout for new board members as well as staff. We always want to bring the best talent to the table. Conducting regular performance review, both individually and collectively. So I usually recommend that a board do a self-evaluation every 2 to 3 years. And then what I do with boards I'm working with we do an annual self-evaluation. So we create an expectation form that all board members sign annually to basically renew, say, yes, I'm on board with these expectations. I will fulfill them. It helps with accountability. What we do is we convert that form to a self-evaluation. So how well do you feel like you did this past year on this item? How well do you feel like you did on this? And then we ask them questions like, looking ahead at the next year, how do you see yourself contributing to this board? Do you want to continue to serve on the same committee? Do you want to serve as an officer? Do you want to be considered as part of succession planning, training for an officer position. Do you want to resign from the board? So it's an opportunity. Ideally, you want to have a dialogue, but we do create a form, which then leads to a conversation. And the governance committee is the committee of the board, by the board, for the board. They are the committee that really needs to be, in my opinion, should be one of your strongest and most active committees. Because governance work and developing the board, recruiting new board members is so critical to your success as an organization. I have never, ever seen an exceptional organization with a weak board. And vice versa. It doesn't happen. So investing in strengthening your governance practices, building a strong foundation will pay off in the long term. Anything else you want to add about board operations?
No, I think you covered it. I just, the governance committee, you do want a strong governance committee, and it will be the most active committee. They'll have the most meetings, but I agree with you. So good.
For new organizations, which we are. What is and I know I'm being specific and you're going to be general, and I'm okay with that. What is the ideal number of communicative board members? I mean, if you have 700 board members, that's not going to work. I understand that. But what is the ideal sort of working relationship between the board? How many people would be ideal?
So I'll give you the standard consultant answer. It depends, right?
Yes.
So I get this question a lot. So I'll share nationally, the data tells us the average size board is 15, and it's been getting smaller over the years.
Okay.
So you need to decide as an organization what kind of representation that we need. What kind of skills, characteristics, expertise, spheres of influence, geographic representation, et cetera, is really going to contribute robust dialogue and discussion to our board discussions and decision-making. You know, fundamentally, who serves on your board influences the decisions that the organization makes, the direction that the organization makes. So being very thoughtful, and there's some tools that I use when I'm working with boards, a board matrix, although there are some shortcomings to using a board matrix, but basically it's a grid that shows who's already on your board. What are the characteristics that you're looking for in a board? Professional backgrounds, geographic, diversity, race, ethnicity, you know, all of those things that really make for good, robust discussions. And what we know, and data shows us out of Harvard, that the more diverse a group is, the better and more creative decisions they make. It's not always easy when you have diverse opinions, but ultimately you want a body that is making the best decisions on behalf of this organization. Even if you have a devil's advocate on your board, you know, that produces more healthy, robust discussion, someone to challenge what you're thinking. You know, the Challenger, one of the Spaceship Challenger, groupthink was one of the problems with this, the explosion and why that happened. So having people with diverse experience, diverse perspectives can add a lot of value.
Couple things to add. I recommend an odd number. You've got to figure out how many are they going to show up? Are you going to have a quorum? You know, we're going to talk about this with the bylaws, but it's really important. You want to think how many board members you're going to have. And I do think 12 to 20 is a good number. I'd have an odd number because you always you don't want to have an impasse in a vote. And you want to determine that you have enough board members, because not every board member is going to be able to attend every single meeting. And so one of my roles is I'm constantly, when we have board or I sit on our governance, I'm a non-voting, but I'm counting, okay, who's here? Do we have enough? Because we tend to vote at every meeting. And so those are things to take into consideration. And then just with diversity, age is really important. We're in a retirement community. It's easy to have a bunch of retired individuals on the boards. It's really important to get those under 45. If they're hard to find, they're busy, they're raising kids, they're working on their career. Not all of them have time to sit on boards, but they really do bring in a good perspective. And they also bring in a perspective with all the technology and social media and everything. They can really bring some good insight to how you operate. So,
And I'll just add, because I do a lot of governance work, if your board is struggling with quorum, you have bigger issues, right? And we need to start having conversations about expectations, about board culture. If you have board members, and I see it, that haven't attended a meeting in a year, and we're going to talk about legal responsibilities next, and that might be a good time to just switch. They're not fulfilling their legal duties. And I always say your board can only be as strong as its weakest member, right? It affects the culture of the board when you have board members that consistently are not showing up. Plus, they're not able to fulfill their legal duties. It's not an easy conversation to have, but oftentimes what I find is board members that haven't been showing up, they feel a sense of obligation, usually to an individual, to fulfill their commitment, but they're not. So there's this tension, unease of not being able to fulfill that. So sometimes people just need to be given permission to just let go and release, right? People vote with their feet anyway. So the legal responsibilities of a board. So yes, there are, under nonprofit corporation law, board members need to meet certain standards of conduct and attention in carrying out their responsibilities to the organization and also to ensure public trust. So the first one is duty of care. This describes a level of competence that is expected. This is often commonly referred to as the prudent person rule. And basically the language there is that the duty of care that an ordinarily prudent person would exercise in a like position under similar circumstances. So this means that people need to be attending your meetings regularly, that they need to review the material ahead of time, come prepared to discuss it, ask pertinent questions, and use their best judgment. True or false, do board members always make good decisions?
Absolutely.
So it's as a board member, right? They don't, but we're asking them to use their best judgment, prudent person role, given the information that they have at the time. So that's duty of care. And duty of loyalty is a standard of faithfulness. A standard of faithfulness. And basically the duty of loyalty says that you will have undivided allegiance to the organization when making decisions. And that you will never use information that you gain as insider for your own personal gain as a board member. We really want independent members. So I see this a challenge oftentimes with organizations that have family members on the board. So say it's a residential program, and then they have members of the family on the board. Hopefully they have a conflict of interest assigned, but at the same time, are they being independent in their decision-making? When the board is making decisions about the cost of the residential housing and other matters that would affect their family member, are they able to be independent? So it's so important to make sure that you have independent board members. I worked with a board, the organization dissolved, no longer exists, that half of the board members were friends and neighbors of the CEO. So basically the CEO was running the show and everybody was deferring to her. And you had a very weak board. CEO retired. When the CEO announced retirement, half the board left because they were there because of their loyalties to the CEO. So you have to also be very mindful and careful of the relationships that you have. Would it be okay, in your opinion, to bring on a family member of a staff member that's not the CEO, but of a staff member? I see head nods, no. Right, so say that staff member is the director of development and that board member happens to be the chair of the philanthropy committee. Or the organization, their development director is not performing well and they have to let that person go. So, there are potential conflicts there. And then finally, duty of obedience, and this requires board members to be faithful to the organization's mission. We talk sometimes about mission drift or mission creep. Sometimes organizations will chase the dollars, a new funding pool becomes available. Well, we can offer this new program and be able to access this pot of money. So as a board member, you need to challenge that thinking and making sure that we're staying faithful to the central goals and purpose of the organization, that we're also staying faithful to state, federal, local laws, and we're also staying faithful to our bylaws. So our bylaws, and we're going to dive deeper into those. Next is our rules. It's basically your constitution as an organization, and it is legally binding. It is a legally binding document. An insurance agent once told me that if you have a D&O claim, directors and officer claim, the insurance company may not pay it if they find that you are not in compliance with your bylaws, right? And so all of the organizations that I do governance work with, when I review their bylaws, I would say 95% of them are, at least in some area, are not compliant. And oftentimes their non-compliance is around term limits. Lazy boards don't enforce term limits. And committees is another very simple one. They list out standing committees. If you're saying these are our standing committees, by definition, standing committees means that these committees are meeting on a regular basis. If those committees are not meeting on a regular basis, you are not compliant with your bylaws. So those are the legal duties. Does anyone have any questions about any of those? Anything from Zoom? All right, great.
So these are the legal documents that you should have, and we are going to get, I know you guys are anxious to get to policies, or I'm assuming you're anxious to get to policies. We will get to policies on another slide. But your articles of incorporation, how you were incorporated, who incorporated with you, you're going to file those with the Department of State. You're going to do your annual report every year. And you're probably not going to amend those very often unless you list your place of business and maybe you change your place of business or your registered agent has changed. Those are things you may amend your articles, which again, you want to file your amended articles. But the annual report is where you kind of keep the state of Florida up to date on who your board officers are, who's running your organization, your president, CEO, if you have a CFO, and your place of business. Your bylaws, I think it's important, as Christy said, you should be reviewed. If you're the executive director, president, CEO, you should have a copy of your bylaws on you. Anytime you're in a board meeting, a committee meeting, any type of internal meeting, especially the board bylaws, if you're meeting with board members, you want to have a copy of those. We just had a governance meeting last night. The board said, we want to change our annual meeting date. You know, it conflicts with too much. Can we move it forward? And we had to pull out our bylaws. Did our bylaws mention that? Do we need to amend our bylaws? Can we operationally meet a sooner annual meeting date? So our president CEO, she has a notebook that, you know, she likes paper. You can keep it on your laptop or your tablet, but it's important you always have that. And it's important to review it because perhaps you're going to change your number of board members. So what's in a bylaw? You've got your name, your where your office is located, your board members. You're going to say how many board members minimum you must have. You're going to talk about their duties, their powers, the term of the board. I agree with Christy. You need to have terms, you need to have term limits, and you need to roll those people off the board. Because the longer board members stay, the less innovation you're going to have as you're moving forward and operating.
Attrition is good.
Yes, attrition is good. And you should have language in your bylaws that if they roll off the board, how long they have to stay before you can bring them back on. Because sometimes you do have that great board member that you're like, term limits are up. We had one 3 years ago. And we really didn't want to lose this board member, but we have term limits. And we are actually, which is very rare for us, we're bringing this board member, we have reappointed this board member because they've set out for 3 years. And we're super excited to get this board member who will start in our next fiscal year. You want to talk about the powers of the board, the duties, the powers, as I said, terms. What happens if you have a vacancy? If you bring a new board member on, is that board member filling that person who's left the vacant term, or are they coming on in a new term? And that needs to be voted upon and discussed and shown in your minutes. If you're removing, hopefully you don't have to remove board members, but every once in a while you have board members who don't show up to anything. And like this treasurer that Christy talked about, that treasurer should have been removed first from the office. If they aren't at every board, your treasurer should be at every single board meeting. I mean, you should be reviewing your financials at every single board meeting. So if the treasurer is not showing up, do they need to be removed from the office, and do they need to be removed from the board? And even though those are hard conversations, you've got to have them. And then you should have language that if you're a volunteer or you're a not-for-profit organization, your board members are not going to be compensated. So you want that language. You can compensate them if they're doing, say they're an attorney on the board and they're doing actual legal work for your organization, or a CPA and you decide to hire the CPA. You can hire for their professional work that they do for the organization, but as a board member, you're not going to pay them. You're going to talk about your officers. You always are going to have a president, a vice president, chair, vice chair, treasurer, and secretary. Your secretary, whether or not, depending on how big your staff is, maybe somebody else is drafting the minutes, but your secretary should always sign the minutes, corporate resolutions. You should mention who the employee of the board is. So if it's the president or CEO or executive director, and what their duties are. And then you should list your standing committees. You should have indemnification language in your bylaws, which basically says that the corporation is going to indemnify the board members, and that the bylaws give authority for the corporation or the organization to buy insurance. That's important to have in there. You'll have something on your books and records that your organization is going to keep complete books and records. You should have your fiscal year. What's your fiscal year end date? We have our non-discrimination policy within our bylaws. And then how do you amend them? And amending them is they have to go back, they have to be amended by approval of the board. And so that's what should be in your bylaws. And your bylaws, as Christy said, and I'll see if she has other things to add, but they are really the operating agreement on how your board of directors is going to operate on an ongoing basis.
You had a question.
Yes, when you mentioned earlier that you can hire your CPA who may be on the board, how do they report? Do they report during a board meeting if they're on the board and you hired them as a treasurer or as a fundraiser or as something that in a professional role?
So in that professional role, they have a conflict of interest as a board member because now they're earning. So they would step out of their shoes. We would report, okay, you're not acting as a board, you're reporting on what you've done. So say they prepared your 990 and they're presenting the 990 for the board to approve. They won't vote on the 990. They will just present it.
I see.
And then
they can present in
because you've hired them in their professional capacity, not as a board member, but in their professional capacity. And it's very important that your minutes, describe that the board approved, because your board should approve who you're hiring. If you're hiring a professional, for 990s or investments, and then that board member should be representing, I'm in my professional capacity here, not in my board capacity. And that should be documented.
And I'll just add to that. So the IRS penalizes people that take advantage of their position within nonprofit organizations. And so this is called intermediate sanctions, which talks about excess benefit for disqualified people. Excess benefit is often defined as greater than fair market value, disqualified person is anybody who can situationally influence the organization. That could be staff, board, donor, etc. So I think a good practice to have is, yes, you need to have your conflict of interest disclosures, all of that signed annually. If there is a conflict, it needs to be identified early on, and that member needs to not participate in discussion and decisions. It's also a good idea to get quotes for services, up to 3 quotes if something's going to be over a certain amount. Just so you have that documentation of fair market value if it ever comes into question. Oftentimes, if they're board members, they're providing a deep discount that you would never be able to get elsewhere. But again, it's, you know, as far as the IRS is concerned, we just need to document and have it all transparent. So go ahead.
Before we move on, excuse me. After filing the 990, the F1120, is it required if you have no unrelated income? Unrelated income, like you're not selling t-shirts or you're not doing anything like that. You simply have a donation, period. Isn't an F1120 required? Oh,
You know, I'm not familiar, I'm not a tax
Okay.
person, but if you're talking about unrelated business income, I think Betsy's going to be talking about that a little bit later in the forms that you need to complete. It may surprise you what might be considered unrelated business income for a nonprofit. For example, selling advertisement in your newsletter or something like that. That's unrelated business income. But Betsy will talk a little bit more about that. I'm not familiar with that specific form, so I can't really comment. So I will say on your bylaws, Florida statute 617 is the one that refers to nonprofit corporate law. It is a tome. There is a lot of information there, and boy, is it fun reading. What I find is a phrase they use quite a bit in that document is, unless your bylaws state otherwise, it's this. So it's important for you all to be clear about how you're operating. One of the handouts that we gave you was some questions. I like to do scenarios when I'm working with boards and revising their bylaws. So tell me, how would you approach a situation where you have a board member that's not showing up? How do we need to make sure that that's reflected in our bylaws? So thinking scenario wise, what is the worst case scenario? We get a board chair in here that's not performing as expected, but yet they're on for a 3-year term. How do we need to make sure that there's a way to remove someone for office? An example that I'll do with officers now with boards is they have a 1-year term that is renewable for another year up to 3 terms. That way you have that continuity if you so choose and if they're performing well. But if they're not, it's very easy at the end of that year. I won't say very easy because there's egos involved. To say thank you for your service. Our organization needs a new chair based on where we're at right now and what we need. So just really thinking through possible scenarios when you're revising your bylaws. And another one, for example, you see quite a bit now is voting without a meeting. So the way the state statute reads is that unless your bylaws state otherwise, voting without a meeting requires 100% of your board members to vote. So if you're doing an email vote, or if you're using a board platform, like Boardable is one that I use a lot, and board members are voting, if you got 80%, it doesn't pass, right? We think this is being efficient by voting in between, getting things done, getting things moving. But you have to have 100% board participation. What you don't get when you do those voting without a meeting is the opportunity for robust discussion and deliberation. So I don't recommend it for controversial things that really we need to be face-to-face having these conversations. But if you're voting on a new board member or doing some routine items, you know, those things are okay. But as the bylaw or as the state statute reads, you have to have 100% unless your bylaws state otherwise. So you could say in your bylaws, we need to have an 80% participation. So important to note.
Just to be clear, you have to have 100% voting participation, but not everyone has to vote yes.
Correct.
And I agree, you really should spell all this out in your bylaws. I mean, and if you, I think, Odie, we have sample bylaws that we can share. I think, or if I can give you sample bylaws to share, but you want to try to get a current, especially as the day, I mean, our environment has changed so much since the pandemic with everything. We have board members who attend meetings via Zoom, just like we have participants attend via Zoom, that some board members, I may not see in person for a year. So it's just important that I suggest you put as much in your bylaws as you can, reflecting voting and who has to participate and when you need unanimous, when you need majority, when you need, what constitutes a quorum, all of those things. And it is covered in this Florida statute. And, it can be long to read, but you can find your issues in there. And then my recommendations is you want to cover it. If it says unless covered in the bylaws, you want to cover it in your bylaws. So you're in compliance and you're not going against what the Florida statute says.
So every 3 years, you should be reviewing your bylaws at a minimum. I have another question. Yes.
So what if you have a professional such as an attorney on the board and they never attend meetings, but they will answer a professional question if needed? Should you keep that person on the board?
I mean, you're really asking them their professional advice. So they're acting in their role as a professional in their capacity. I get you want to have an attorney on your board because you want to be, you want the free legal advice, and usually they help with creating documents and those type of things. I think you really have to have, this is my opinion, you have to communicate with that board member that they are serving on the board. And yes, you appreciate all the time, but we need you at these meetings, because how can they really give advice if they're not sitting at a board meeting and listening to the issues that are being presented before the board? That's just my opinion.
And there's the duty of care. And they have a legal responsibility to be at those meetings, to be informed about what's going on, because there's liability as a board member. And if they're not there participating actively and hearing what's going on.
But I mean, they receive the minutes. No.
They're really doing pro bono work for you.
Right.
It's truly what they're doing. So if they're not if they aren't showing up to any board meetings, perhaps you just say, we love the relationship, we consider this pro bono work that you're doing for us. We really appreciate it. So they may like that. They may say, oh, great, I get pro bono hours, but they're really not a board member. So that's, and then policies. So we're going to talk about policies, but your 990, which we're going to talk about the 990 a little bit in a few minutes, but like 990s they're not required, but they ask, do you have certain policies? You probably want those type of policies. When we talk about financial statements, we're going to talk, how do you find your policy? So we're going to talk about many different policies, and you're going to go, great. Are you going to give us samples of all these policies? No, we're not. But the internet, I use the internet for all of my research, and I'm in-house counsel here. I'm no longer part of any legal service that I go on Westlaw or Lexis. If you're a lawyer, you know what that is. I Google, and I think that's a verb now, I'm not sure, but I use it. I Google everything, and I can find any policy that I'm like, oh my gosh, our policy is 10 years old, and you want to keep track of how old your policies are. If your organization's, we've been around for 43 years, so we've got some pretty old policies that I have constantly updated those policies. And how do I find, well, where do I want most current language? I just search and I can find a policy and I review it and say, how does this apply to our organization? So that's my advice or my comments on policies. Anything you want to add?
So one of the handouts that you received was a list. Betsy had mentioned the IRS asked Do you have these policies? So all of the policies that the IRS asks about are on that list. You know, if the IRS is asking, you probably want to say, yeah. Now, are these policies legally required? No, but compliance with what should be in those policies are required. So you want to make sure that you're being very thoughtful and intentional, but you also want to make sure that you're following those policies, because those policies could be used against you if you're not following them and you say that this is what our standard practice is, but yet you're ignoring them. So you want to make sure whatever policies that you have in place that are being reviewed regularly, to ask the question, are we actually following what we say? And so there's a distinction between policy and then procedure. So oftentimes organizations that I will work with will have the policy section up at the top, and that's really what you want the board to approve. And then the procedure section is below, and oftentimes staff will be involved in that procedure. But the board is really approving the policy statement.
And then if you're a member of Board Source, or sometimes you can pull Board Source
Yes.
documents, that's a great internet source to find policies.
The IRS has a conflict of interest policy. It's lengthy, but if the IRS is putting this policy together and said, this is what we recommend, I use that policy with all of my governance clients. And so they customize it and adopted that as their conflict of interest policy. We ready to move on to board processes? Okay, so board processes. And the other thing to mention is there is a hierarchy. So meaning that if something in your bylaws is inconsistent with something that is written in your articles of incorporation, then your articles of incorporation trump your bylaws. So that's why it's important, if you're changing your bylaws, to also be reviewing your articles at the same time, just to make sure that they're consistent. Oftentimes articles are written so general, which is good and what we recommend, that you don't really have to amend them often, but it happens. Same thing with policies. You want to make sure that your policies are consistent with what's in your bylaws. Again, with your bylaws, when you're writing them, you want them to be general, but specific enough to provide direction to help the board with structure, decision-making, et cetera. So one example there would be your committees. Instead of listing each one of your standing committees, because then you're obligated to have those standing committees meeting regularly, just have language in there that the board has the authority to create committees and task forces as needed and disband them when their work is done. To keep it a little more general. So under board processes, it is, sort of demonstrates thoughtfulness and stability when your organization has processes and procedures in place to support leadership, right? A key purpose of the board is to make decisions. So our processes and procedures and things like that should help the board make informed decisions. So one example I put here is board recruitment. So I had said before, who's on your board, fundamentally influences the decisions it makes, the direction. So you want to be very thoughtful about your recruitment process. Do you have an application form to capture information about this individual? What is their past board experience? What do they think they can bring to this board? Why do they want to serve on this board? What's their professional background? And then having a board matrix that sort of outlines, what do you have on your board? Where are their gaps? What do we need to recruit for? A board candidate profile, which outlines what are the characteristics that we expect in every single board member. And then what are those unique characteristics, skills, demographics, et cetera, that not every board member needs to have, but we want to make sure it's represented. Like, you don't need 6 attorneys, sorry,
That's okay.
on a board of 8. I've been there. Don't recommend it. But just being very, it helps you sort of laser focus in, who are we looking for? It's not just any warm body. We really need a CPA. We need people with credentialed financial background. So then you're laser focused in on, who do we know? What, based on what do we need is the first question. What do we need on our board? And then who do we know? And then being able to just, have a network of, I'll reach out to the foundations. I'm like, we're looking for a CPA or financial people, and they give me a list. And we start working that list and seeing, does this person have some type of affinity to this mission work? Would they be interested in maybe attending a finance committee just to observe and learning about the organization? So just having these processes in place, we have any candidate would attend a governance committee. The governance committee would interview them ahead of time. Governance committee would vote and then make that recommendation to the board. A lot of boards I'm working with these days, we bring people onto a committee first. In fact, All Faith Food Bank, that's all they will never bring anybody onto the board unless they serve on a committee first. It gives that opportunity. It's like dating before you marry. Let's see if this is a good fit. Are they showing up? Are they participating? Before you bring them on the board to make important decisions for your organization. Doesn't that make sense? I know we're always sort of in that we really need people, but recruitment is an ongoing, never ending. It should be going on year round. We're always looking for talent, we're cultivating those relationships. We're letting them know about the organization. We're inviting them to our events. We're getting them involved. And then it's much easier to make that transition into committee, into board. So having those processes in place.
You want to have a potential board member list that, as people recommend, you want to keep track. I mean, I'm thinking of the written documents that you want to have this in writing, and you want your governance committee to review it. So you want, what's your board recruitment process? What's the timing of it? It's really, just as Christy's saying, you're constantly looking for board members. I recommend you have board members start their terms at the beginning of your fiscal year. If you get, and I know you need somebody and you're like, oh my God, we need to put them on our board immediately because we don't want somebody else to grab them. But it really can cause confusion on, okay, when did they start on the board? Do we have a board term? Trying to keep things consistent. And if you have that in a written document, and then the potential board member list, you'll talk to a lot of board members or potential board members who, I don't have time right now. I'm still on this board. I'm going to retire in a couple of years, whatever their reasons are, but you might want to follow up with them 3 years from now. It's important to keep that list, and the governance committee should be the committee that kind of is controls that list or holds those lists.
Having served on boards before, I have found that when we find a talented person, we don't want to wait a whole year to bring them on. So we keep track, when does the term start? And we keep it very simple. So it starts, the first day of the month. And it ends, a year. So typically what I recommend is that the first term on the board should only be 1 year. It's sort of a trial again, and back to let's date before we get married, see if it's a good fit. Are they showing up? Is it what they expected? So the first term is 1 year, oftentimes, and across the country, maximum 6 years is pretty standard. We just break it down differently. So the first term is 1 year, second term is either 2 or 3 years, but ultimately 3 terms totaling 6 years is a structure that I recommend. But just document when they come on the board. I'm not a big fan of somebody fulfilling somebody else's term, because you could get somebody really talented that you want them to be on the board for as long as you can have them. But if they're fulfilling somebody's existing vacant term, and it just gets confusing there. So I say, if you're bringing somebody on, they have a good new term.
Good question about that. Can you bring somebody on and then have it so that their term officially begins like at the fiscal year? Or is it, if they're on the board working and voting, then they need to have, then their term needs to be officially at that point?
It really needs to be official if they're
Yeah.
gonna be a voting board member. So
Well, and that's the key. She said voting board
Right,
member.
and
I
yeah.
mean, they could be a non-vote. I mean, I don't know why you would want that, but I mean, if it's important to you for it to start with and be aligned with the fiscal year, then you can bring them on just to attend and be a non-voting member. But, you know, my question is, why would it be so important that it be aligned with the fiscal year? You know,
And I'm just, I mean, I
Yeah.
totally get what Chrissy said. I'm just disagree. Maybe if you have a large organization, you have so many things to keep track of. Keeping track, oh, your term ends here, your term ends here. I think it's easier to try to keep, this is our board terms, this is how long they are. And so we're
I would
gonna
agree.
agree to
no,
disagree.
I would absolutely agree. It is
Yeah.
easier.
Yeah.
Because you have to have a chart and throughout the year, people are terming at different times. But you have to weigh the cost and benefits. Will us bringing this person on 3 months earlier, will we be able to get the benefit of whatever they bring? You know, put it in your bylaws, whatever your bylaws say. Just a couple other things here, because we are moving right along. Agendas, one of you should have the board chair and the chief executive working in constructive partnership to put the agendas together. I often hear it's always are often delegated to the CEO. It really needs to be a partnership. Those two should be meeting regularly to decide, what are the decisions that we need to make at this meeting? We're bringing our board together. We have those 4 responsibilities: setting direction, ensuring necessary resources, providing oversight, and leading board operations. How are those things showing up in our board agenda? What is our strategic plan? How are those things showing up in our agenda? What are the decisions we need to make? What discussions do we need to have? What information does the board need to support those decisions, to support those discussions? So it's a very thoughtful, sort of thinking through what needs to happen when we come together as a board. I lost my train of thought, but minutes. So your minutes serve as the official and legal record, and can be requested of board and committee meetings. So they are considered legal evidence of the facts they report. So typically, you don't want to include who said what. It's not necessary. You can highlight key points made in a discussion, options that are presented. If documents are presented, you may want to list what documents are presented to the board, but it shouldn't be a transcript. It shouldn't be lengthy narrative. Bottom line, we want to know what was presented, what decisions were made. So what the votes were.
Question, I'm not sure how we can count Zoom meetings, board with the in-person. Is there any certain percentage that people need to be on the Zoom for the bringing some decision? Is there any legal way to, because I was in some boards that basically make a recording of the meeting and then is that okay to have?
I think you need written minutes, but your
Yes.
first question is your bylaws are gonna determine. If.
Because a lot of people now use
You
Zoom,
wanna zoom in.
that's new thing, so I'm just not sure.
What the state statute says, and it's very specific language that should be in your bylaws. It says people can participate in meetings telephonically or otherwise, as long as everybody can hear everyone at the same time. So if there are technical difficulties with Zoom and people's audio is not working, then by state statute, you have some issues that have to be resolved for you all to be using those electronic means. But there's nothing that says that there's a certain percentage of your board meetings that need to be in person or.
Unless it's in your bylaws, if it's.
Unless it's in your
Yeah,
bylaws.
Unless your bylaws require
Yeah.
it.
And minutes for the, like, if it was Zoom meeting and it was recorded.
You
So
have to
I,
have written. I mean, that recording is it's legal. It's subject to the sort of records retention. But
Yeah,
you
that-
need to
that's what I
have,
had
you should
also,
have
so I'm
written,
not-
you have
so
to
that's
have
the-
written minutes because your board needs to be approving those minutes at
At the next
It's
meeting,
the
they'll
next meeting.
approve those. And I highly recommend when the board approves the minutes, your secretary should sign the minutes. It should
Yes.
be, this is an official document. It's not,
Physically sign it?
yes.
yes,
And
I'll make that note.
yes.
And that's just an example. If you have an agency fund here and we're handling your investments and you want to pull principal out, you know, besides just our distribution policy, we want minutes, and it usually comes by me and I say, I need, you know, the details of the date the meeting took place, who attended, what action was presented.
Quorum established.
Yeah, quorum, the vote, what was approved, and then I want to see it signed. And I'll take that over a corporate resolution, you know, if the minutes are detailed and they're signed by the secretary. So and that's just good corporate records.
And a resolution is an action taken by the board which applies to a single act. So sometimes you'll see, instead of it just being in the minutes, a motion. So for example, I had a client that was purchasing a property. So they wrote out the formal whereas, wherefore kind of resolution to document board approval of the purchase of that property. So there are some things, and sometimes foundations would require a corporate resolution being made. And so there may be cause to have, the bottom line is just a decision of the board, a little more formalized.
A formalized document that in that real estate example, that's going to get recorded. That's going to show the board gave authority to, and usually it gives the authority who has the authority on behalf of the organization to sign. So is it the board chair signing everything, or is it the president, CEO, or executive director?
Okay.
Ready to
I
move
like that.
on?
The little quicker clip.
Yeah.
So sunshine laws, since there was no one in here, we won't spend much time on this. I do have some clients that do have to adhere to sunshine. And basically those sunshine law applies if a public entity has delegated the performance of its public purpose to a private entity. So for example, some of the colleges here are state ran, so they have to adhere to sunshine. That means that their meetings and decisions, deliberations need to be made in the sunshine, in the public. So those meetings need to be published, location, time, et cetera, and they need to be open to the public in order to operate in the sunshine. So there are restrictions when 2 or more board members are together, whether it be in a professional setting or social gathering. They cannot be discussing matters that will likely come before the board for a vote. It just makes, it's efficiency, getting things done is a lot more challenging with sunshine, but just know it exists and that there are entities out there. So before you join a board, you want to make sure that you ask if they have to adhere to sunshine law. Yes, ma'am.
The other thing I've encountered, working in nonprofits, is that if you have a public official who's on your board, then you need to specifically understand very differently what email address they're going to use and how they wish to approach that.
Text
relationship.
messages, all of that's public record.
Right.
And can be requested under public records law. So be mindful of those restrictions.
Just again, risk management, insurance, have a good relationship with an insurance agent. You should, you've got to make sure you operate for tax exempt purposes. You should have insurance that covers your directors and officers, and you should have a general commercial liability insurance. Yeah.
You have a list of insurance you would recommend also?
Recommend insurance agents?
Yeah.
I just know who we use. We use Ben Brown Insurance Company.
Insurance?
Yeah, they're,
Here in Sarasota?
yes, here in Sarasota. It's a good one. I mean, they're all good, but that's who we use. And then I just want, we talked about this earlier. You're probably the most claims you're ever gonna have, if you have any, are gonna be employment claims. And your board members need to stay out of, when Christy was talking about, you don't wanna have staff, family members and staff and board family members.
Or
and-
husband and wife
or
on the
husband and
board.
wife, you see a
That's
lot
a
of
no-no.
that. Your board really needs to stay in its lane when there are staff issues. Because even though they want to be, oh, I want to call, and make sure the person, or maybe the employee calls the board member and says, I'm having issues, whatever's happening, the board member's got to keep the board hat on and say, I can't talk to you about these things in my board role, because it will blow your D&O insurance. So,
But your whistleblower policy there may
Whistle-
be,
yeah.
yeah, thinking about the whistleblower, if there is malfeasance or something happening, you make sure that as a board member, you know what the whistleblower policy is and who that person needs to be reporting to. And it could be a board member if that's what the whistleblower
yeah.
policy
Yes,
says.
that's true. And if you have, I don't know if we have large organizations here, if you have a big staff, you should have employee liability insurance. Moving into financial matters. So financial matters, okay, what filings do you need to think about? Obviously, you're a 501c3 organization. Hopefully you've been determined as a public charity, which means you can grant the highest income tax deduction to your donors. You can participate in certain giving days that maybe a private foundation cannot participate in. You always want to have your letter on hand when you're seeking out grants, because they're going to want to see a copy of your IRS determination letter. You have to file a 990 every year. That's your IRS tax return. If you have receipts of 50,000 or less, you can do it in short form. They call it a postcard. I think it's a one-page filing online, but your 990, you have to file it. It's public. And unrelated business activity. So some examples of this, I haven't thought about, selling advertisements or selling t-shirts, but if you receive a donor gives you a really good gift and it earns income off of it. They give you a share, of some type of business. Maybe they give you a piece of property and there's a tenant in there. And that tenant income coming into you has nothing to do with your nonprofit organization. You've got to file a 990T. And I recommend don't discourage those gifts. Those are okay gifts. You just may have to pay tax on that income, which is okay because you're getting the income. So I wouldn't shy away from gifts. And again, it depends on the size of your organization. And I come from a very big organization and we can accept complex assets, but filing a 990T, it's necessary if you have unrelated business activity, and it's really not that big of a deal. So state filings, we talked about, you got to file annual reports with Sunbiz. You obviously need to keep your fundraising registration current under the Solicitation Act. And then, and this is a typo, sorry about that. If you want to get state sales tax exemption, you have to file that every year. And the document that you asked me about, I'm unfamiliar with the Florida.
F-1120 is the name of the corporate tax return for the state of Florida.
Yeah, and I think you report your revenues, but if they're all for your tax exempt purpose, you don't
You don't.
pay any tax, but you have to report that.
That was my understanding.
Yeah, that-
That's how I filed. I did not do a state return because we did not have any unrelated income.
Right.
I do want to make a comment as a tax accountant.
Yeah, love
I do
it.
want to make a comment with the tax exempt sales tax.
Yeah,
This is misused often. When you are an organization, you need to pay sales tax on the items that you are purchasing for your use. But if you are purchasing something, for example, t-shirts, where you would purchase them from a print shop and resell them, then you don't pay the print shop sales tax. However, you have to charge Mr. John Q. Public sales tax. They want it, it's like a train. They want their 7% on the most highest price tag possible. But a lot of people that were doing their tax returns, they would say, oh, I didn't pay any sales tax on my Staples stuff because I have a tax exempt. No, when you use this stuff, it's called the sales and use tax. So when you're using something, paper, pencils, whatever, you gotta pay the sales tax on that stuff.
Well, that is news to me.
Yes.
And I don't know if we're doing that. All right, I'll have to share that
That's
with our
why I mentioned
CFO.
it, because everyone I came across my desk, I would say, no, if you're using the paper,
Yeah.
you gotta pay sales tax to Staples. But if you were selling it along, I don't know, making a newspaper or whatever, when you sell the newspaper, then you charge sales tax and remit it to Tallahassee. So anyway, that's my 2 cents for today.
All right. And to the next slide.
Okay, so while there are no hard and fast rules on an audit, typically what we see is budgets over $1 million. You want to have an audit. Less than $1 million, you could probably do a financial review by an outside person, which is a lot less expensive than having an audit done. Audit is expensive. Sometimes foundations, depending on the size of their grant, might request an audit. Of course, if you get state funding and federal, you're going to be required to do an audit.
Thank you for covering that.
Oh,
I'll go
I was
back.
just having,
Yeah,
it's okay, no, all right. And then key policies. What questions do you have about policies? Anything listed here? I don't want to spend time going through any of these. Like I said, these are all listed on the handout that was given to you. I think it's good to have a place where you have all of your policies listed. They should be reviewed at least every 3 years to make sure that you're operating in compliance with them. Maybe even reminding board members about the policies that you have in place. Any specific questions about any of these policies that we can answer?
Real quick. Internally, you've got your budget. You should be comparing your budget your actual to your budget on a monthly basis. And you should be sharing that with your board at board meetings. So the board is up to date on where you stand financially at each board meeting and then at year end. And that's really important because that's going to tell you, are you going to be operating in the red or are you bringing in enough revenue or grants to cover all your expenses? So I forgot to cover that, but that's important. And then you want to, review your balance sheet. And if you get restricted gifts versus, just unrestricted gift that you can use everything, you want to show that separately. And you want to make sure you're using those gifts for those restricted purposes, because if you don't, the donor's still living, they get very upset. Maybe they cut off, the grant making or the gifts to
Yes.
you. So that's
Donor intent is everything, right?
Yeah, it is. So,
So a couple other things, if you're big enough to have an audit committee, your audit committee should be separate than your finance committee with no overlap in membership. Sort of that checks and balances. There was another thought that I had and I lost it.
okay, well, we're coming to the end. We're getting there.
So lobbying and political activities. So I often see a misunderstanding of nonprofits as it pertains to lobbying and what's allowed. In fact, I got an email newsletter the other day from a national nonprofit that I subscribe to saying the language was, as a nonprofit, we cannot lobby. I typed it back and I said, well, that's not actually true. There are limitations, however, for 501c3 organizations, which are those with educational, charitable, and religious intent. There are limitations on how much time in the language that is used, and there is a test. And you have to report this to the IRS, how much is spent from a resource standpoint on lobbying activities to influence legislation. 501c4s, 5s and 6, unlimited amount of lobbying that they can do. C3s, you can lose your tax exempt status if it is a significant amount of your activities in time. The other thing to keep in mind is 501c3s may not participate or intervene in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to a specific candidate for public office. So political campaigning can jeopardize your 501c3 status. Nonpartisan activities are permissible. You can get out the vote as long as you're not, advocating for any particular candidate. Yes, it's okay to educate the public and help them participate in the electoral process. Yes to candidate forums, but context is important. You need to give equal opportunities to all candidates. Advocacy is permissible as long as the advocacy furthers your mission. There's a great resource called Stand for Your Mission. I recommend that you share it with your boards. Stand for Your Mission. If you just Google that, the website will come up and you can download the resource. You may not use advocacy as an excuse for or to double as political campaign intervention. And you must avoid mentioning voting, the election, or identifying whether candidates agree with its position as well. So just be very careful. It would probably be a good idea for your board to have a policy around lobbying, political activity, et cetera, about what's permissible and what's not, based on the IRS.
We have this in our conflict of interest. We review this with our board every year when we talk about, okay, here's a policy on conflicts of interest. We have a code of conduct and we cover political basically any political activity. We do lobby. We have a lobbyist up in DC. We lobby for charitable incentive laws that we want anything that will help people want to make contributions to charities. So we do lobby for that. We are very big into education. So when the referendum about the mill tax, they were gonna, I think, increase the mill tax, we supported it. So there's some, examples of things that you can do, but you want to make sure your staff and your board know in their capacity, I'll get to your question in a second, in their capacity as a board member or in their capacity as a staff member, they cannot be a part of a political campaign. And it's really interesting, especially around presidential elections. I'm constantly have a few staff members that I really like this candidate. And I'm like, you can't wear any of our logos. You can't really promote, don't do it on social media. You really need to, that's your individual. I can't say you can't do it as an individual, but you definitely can't do it as a staff or a board member. Camille.
So I was on the Pineview Association board, which obviously has a great stake in the education referendum. And we had some board members who were convinced that it was against, right? And that conversation went too long and it actually hurt that board quite a bit. This was several years ago, obviously, but it is so important. I'm actually writing a note right now to that board, making sure that they do not let that conversation go past speculation. They can't speculate. They have to, and because we told them, your board chair, former board chair, Dan DeLeo even told them.
Yeah.
And emphasized that this was something that they could completely support
Yeah.
because it supported education.
Right.
And otherwise that school alone would lose $1.4 million
Yeah.
per year if that mill had not been.
That was right in their mission.
Right.
Yeah.
There are
So
significant
thank you for saying that,
implications.
saying that, Ms.
Yeah,
Kennedy. Please do.
Absolutely. There's that saying, if you're not at the table, you're on the table. So as nonprofits, it is so important that you take a stand for those issues that will impact those you serve and the mission that you're trying to achieve. I have clients that have lobbyists as well. One, for example, they've lobbied the state and had the local delegation in their corner and was able to access an additional $8 million annually to fund the delivery of their programs and services. They had a task force of community leaders that they convened. They had community forums with the delegation there. And all of that work, all of that effort resulted in a significant increase. Yeah.
Question in the chat, how about partnering with a political party to only educate people on the importance of voting?
What was the last?
On the importance of voting. I would not partner with a particular political party. You could promote the importance of voting, but I would not line up with one side or the other. I think.
Unless you're gonna do it with both, it's
Yeah.
gotta be equal, but to
Yeah.
Betsy's point, I would just do it independently.
Yes.
So let me be clear, I understand, the 2024 election that's coming up as a board member. Did I understand you to say that you shouldn't promote anyone on social media wearing a T-shirt or anything like that as a board member?
As a board member, and Christy may have a different answer. I just think you want your board, and it depends the size of your organization and how prominent your board members are. But they just need to make sure that they are not promoting a particular political candidate that somebody may mistake as, oh, you're the board chair of this organization. Your organization must support that political candidate. So you just have to be careful. Social media as a lawyer, it scares the heck out of me with what people put on social. I mean, I can't even name people put on social media. So you just want to remind them that their role is in their capacity as a board member, they cannot support or promote a particular candidate. Individually, you can't tell them what to do individually.
Right. I mean, it's the organization that the IRS is concerned with, and the organization doesn't. But the affiliation of this individual to the organization may come into question. Is it an organization event where this person is wearing a T-shirt, promoting a candidate? Just being mindful of the context.
Okay, do you guys want to talk about gift agreements and
Yes.
memorandum? Okay, all right.
We gotta pause.
We're coming into the end. Okay, and I'm not talking about pledges. We don't do a lot of pledges here at the Community Foundation, so I cannot give you my opinion on what's a legally binding pledge, but I can talk about gift agreements and I can talk about memorandum of understandings. With gift agreements, it's really important you got to identify the parties, who's the donor, who's the recipient or donee, your organization. You want to spell out what's the contribution, the consideration, the gift being given, and is it over a term of years? And when is the expectation of the first payment to be made? So if you have a capital campaign and somebody's gonna gift you 500,000, but they want to pay you 100,000 over 5 years, you want that really spelled out. You want the purpose of the gift to be really, articulated in the gift agreement, and what happens if the purpose can't be met. And I worked on a gift agreement with Moat, and they have really good language. They're building, this big aquarium and educational facility. And we had a donor that wanted to give money and name one of the research labs. Well, and I'm just throwing out numbers, I don't remember the exact specific, but say they thought they were going to have 5 research labs and 3 educational classrooms. Well, the building plans, as you know, when you build walls, things get changed. Now they're only going to have 4 labs, but they might have 4 or 5 educational. The agreement should talk about, and the parties should agree before any money is exchanged. If we can't do what the purpose is you want, can we repurpose that gift for this? We'll talk to you about it, but can we do that? That should be spelled out in the gift agreement. And I think those are good conversations just to have when you're raising big money. Recognition, attribution given for the gift, how you're going to recognize them. And that should be, are you going to put their name on a plaque? Are you going to put their name on a wall? If you have the dimensions of how you're going to promote, how you're going to put that name on the wall, put that in the gift agreement or have it as an attachment or an exhibit. The naming rights, I'm going to use Moat again. I think this is really good. they have termination of naming rights, termination language, which I'll be honest, our donors were not happy about. They're like, well, we're giving you this money. We want our name on, we want our grandkids to be able to see that we contributed.
Perpetuity.
Yeah, in perpetuity. Well, it's not good for the nonprofit organization because in 15, 20 years, you're gonna need to make improvements and renovate and do things, and you may need to raise money for those renovations, and you want the ability to take their name off. So how did we solve that with the donor? We said, give our donors first right of refusal before you take it out to another donor. And that seemed to satisfy our donor, and Moat said, no problem. And we wrote that in the agreement. So that I thought that was really creative, that they are not promising in perpetuity for certain building
Most
rights.
Organizations know to do that instinctively, like the spirit of the process,
They
like
do,
they
okay.
do, yeah. But I think that's nice that you put that in there.
Yeah, I just spell out anything you contemplate, you want it written. Yes.
When they had first right of refusal, did that mean that they had to contribute more in order to?
Yes. Yeah,
Continue?
so basically, the agreement is naming rights terminate, and it had the specific date, the date of the agreement, 15 years from the date of this agreement. So whenever we sign the agreement, naming rights will terminate. And then we had a sentence, the donors will be given first right of refusal to determine if they want to recontribute or make an additional contribution. And the donors understood that.
And with a time frame too.
With a
So
time
it's-
frame, yeah, with the right of refusal.
Of when you will have to make that decision by.
Yeah,
What time frame?
like you might give them 60 days, 90
Or a
days.
year,
Yeah.
that if it's a 7-year or 10-year agreement, when there's 1 year remaining, you'll want to start having that discussion because you have to go get another donor if they're not going to renew.
Love it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So we think that's important. You also want language, which I think this is usually in it, the reputation of the donor changes. Your donor could get themselves in some legal problems, and you may not want that donor's name on your building or on a room that your prospect donors are walking into every day going, oh, wow, okay, that person was a big donor of yours. I'm not sure I want to give to this organization. So you want language that if the reputation changes, that the nonprofit organization has the authority to remove their name from the recognition that's being given.
What's the criterion for the reputation change? Who makes that decision and how?
It's usually given to the nonprofit organization can make the decision.
Probably the board.
That's something that is, if you, to think through the cycle, to have that in your gift acceptance policies also. So that that's not just true for naming, but there are times when if someone is a convicted felon, having worked in a lot of nonprofits that involve schools and children, we on occasion did have someone who had either been a volunteer or a donor who 3 or 5 years down the road, it turns out they had a record on some offense that related to children. And we had in all of our official policies, the ability to take their name off of our stuff. And they knew it. I mean, it wasn't secret. It's part of this. There's a cycle or a connectivity of your documents.
But it really should be the organization who is accepting the money, who's they should have the sole discretion to determine the reputation. And of course, they're not going to want to upset. I mean, if the donor doesn't have a reputation, they're not going to take the donor's name off because they're hoping to get more money from that donor. That's my opinion. And then,
Excuse
go
me,
ahead.
your slide says mutual consent of the parties. That means the convicted felon must comply with his removal, right?
That's amendment of the agreement. The original agreement carries that clause that says we can take your name off. Amending the agreement is mutual.
Yeah, the last point that you're reading, and I do have a typo, sorry, at the third point should be met, not me. And I noticed that this morning, so sorry about that. The gift agreement, so the overall gift agreement, not the reputation of the donor. These are just bullet
Gotcha,
points.
okay.
The gift agreement, you want language that says it can be amended. And again, I should have had mutual written consent. You both need to sign an amendment. One party can't amend it without the other party's signature, or it can't be amended. Does that make sense?
Now, yeah,
Okay.
that makes sense.
Gift agreements and memorandum of understandings are different. Gift agreement is a contract. And once consideration is given by both parties, it's a legally binding contract. A memorandum of understanding doesn't always have to be legally binding. It's truly an agreement between parties is, we're gonna make, at least this is my opinion on it. We're gonna make this grant to you. Here's what the purpose is for. Here's the attribution we want, and maybe some gift reporting we want. And you, nonprofit organization, are going, great, we're gonna accept it. We're gonna use it for this purpose. We're gonna report back to you that this is how the money was expended. And we might have, if it's a multi-year gift, we might have language in there, which we usually do, that says the grant report must come prior to the next set of funding to go out. And we might have to have a meeting to discuss before future funding goes out. So it's really just to get things documented. It's like when you have a meeting with somebody and you verbally talk about all these things and nothing's written down. I always recommend to my staff, and I do it if I'm in a meeting, I send an email back and say, this is what I understood that we talked about. You're gonna do this and I'm gonna do that. Please reply to me and confirm. I mean, Christy and I did this, preparing this presentation. You're gonna do this, right? I'm gonna do this. Then we would send each other things back and forth. That's not a memorandum of understanding, but that's what memorandum of understandings do for two organizations. They basically say, this is what you're doing, this is what I'm doing, these are my expectations, these are your expectations, and you agree to it. Does that make sense? So, so that's kind of any questions. And then your bylaws should determine who signs gift agreements on behalf of the organization. It depends. They may give that power to the president, CEO, or executive director, or the board chair may sign it. And again, and the same thing with memorandum of understanding. Who has authority to sign the documents should be stated in your bylaws.
Is there a floor of when you use a gift agreement, like there's a dollar amount floor that is typical?
I don't know of a floor, and memorandum of understandings, I draft them all the time for our organization, and I typically don't draft them unless it's 100,000 gift or higher.
That's helpful. Yeah.
And I've seen gift agreements for 50,000.
Yeah.
It really depends what the purpose of the gift is for, and if
And usually if it's like a naming, and so that we're saying we'll be naming.
Yeah.
That's where I've done it underneath that 100,000.
Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions? Well, we're almost finished. Christy, you wanna
So
handle our
just,
closing?
adopting a culture of inquiry as leadership is important. We've put some questions here as you're looking at scenarios, possibilities. If you hear something else in the news, what is the likelihood that this risk would happen to us? So start having those conversations and thinking about scenarios. How do we protect our assets? How do we protect our reputation? What policies do we need to put in place? So, and weighing what the impact would be on our organization, on our financial situation, our reputation, et cetera. So culture of inquiry. The world is complex and ever changing, and adopting a culture of inquiry and asking those right questions, being present, adapting, being flexible and responsive, and protecting the organization's name, its assets is absolutely an essential function of the leadership. And I hope that you learned something new today.
I thank you for coming and participating, and we appreciate your questions and your thoughts, and
Yep.
Go out.
Around. Yeah.